Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I am Rhombus Tix. This is a series called Swamp Castle, where I read some of my older stories. And today I'm going to read you Gratitude Begats. Bisha was not happy. She had not signed up for this sort of thing. She was a second-rank medical technician, not some swamp-tromping, leather-booted Marine. It wasn't fair. She was supposed to be able to see the sights of the galaxy without selling her soul for it. She looked down at the tiny canister at her hip. She had to get this to Snot Landing or there wouldn't be anyone there to save. A lesser person would have boldly considered herself a hero, working to save hapless, ignorant ground pounders with the celestial technology from on high. She knew better. She had a debt to pay. Lightning struck the trees again. One foot went in front of the other. She slowly made her way forward. It was raining. It was always raining. It would be raining for the next 400 years. Her muscles ached. Her lungs screamed for release, but she had to measure her oxygen. The filters, powered by the movement of her body, slowly converted the atmosphere around her into breathable oxygen. The reserve tank was for emergencies only, and she had a suspicion that out here in the middle of nowhere, there were going to be plenty of emergencies. She saw something in the distance. At first, she thought it was might be a radical or the like, but they operated on an entirely different continent. It was impossible that they would be out here. It wasn't impossible that they would be out here, just very unlikely. A building slowly emerged from the gloom. It surprised her. The cabin was a godsend. She didn't know who owned it, but she headed there as quickly as she could. A tiny part of her hoped that she could dump the vaccine with the local and send them onward, but she was not so naive as to believe that such a thing was possible or likely. Her life just didn't work that way. The food had been the first thing to collapse, and that had made everything else stop working. Azeroth was a hell planet, well without the creature comforts of home. Terraforming was a finicky process designed to enhance life as much as possible, and that included the smallest kind of life. Nature had a way of taking advantage of opportunities, and right now, Azeroth might as well have been a giant neon sign in orbit that said, 4 horsemen welcome. Slower than light travel made it difficult for ships to cross the vast gulfs between stars. Even with the cheat drive, they could only cut that by a factor of half. And all the shortcuts in the universe wouldn't give them the ability to send a distress call faster than the nearest courier ship. Hell worlds like Azeroth didn't have courier ships. Indeed, with the exception of the occasional trader, the medship was the only ship to ever visit them on a regular basis. Part of the Zerah Code demanded that all citizens have access to top-tier medical care, even if that care was only available on a 4-year basis. Thus, the circuit ships ran between 7 to 10 hell worlds, usually stopping at a node to replenish supplies or provided much-needed R&R for the crew. Bisha had only signed up for one tour of duty. After that, she was either going to sign up for one of the Navy ships or an explorer. There was always a demand for trained personnel. She could set her own terms. They could churn out ships faster than people could film them, but they could only cram knowledge into so many heads at a time. People who knew what they were doing and could be trusted to do it were the only bottleneck to man's expansion to the stars. And even that wasn't saying much. Just thinking of home made her long for sunlight. She'd only been on this planet for 7 hours and she already hated it. She hated the smells, she hated the ignorance that people here think that they could tamper with democracy and just let it die while they let a system unravel around them. Above it all, she hated that it was because it was dirty, grimy, and slimy. She was a medical technician. She didn't work with people, only machines. Slime was not something that she had signed up for, and yet now she was almost drowning in it. The people on the stations lived very comfortably. There were 3 of them that hung in orbit. The larger held the engineers, technicians, scholars, and politicians of the colony. The lower rungs of society, those who could not afford to live on that station, had to deal with being in one of the settlements on the ground. There were some people who argued that there was no reason to go to the planetary surface in the first place, and that all the money spent terraforming the planet could simply be spent building more stations for people to live in. However, the people that ran the company, who owned the planet, and essentially all the people on it, had been born on a planet and felt that that was the proper way of doing things. A planet was a proper long-term investment. A station could malfunction at any time. That was their view, at the least. Of course, there hadn't been a single fatality from a total station failure in over 100 years. Accidents, to be sure, but station accidents were much more rare than groundside ones because people who were on them were so well trained. They knew that space was dangerous and had to work for their survival rather than take it for granted. On the other hand, things had malfunctioned pretty badly. They should have sent a robot, but the idiot rebel droids just shot down anything that their sensors picked up. Ultimately, the only way to get a vaccine through was to put it on a person, and that person being a human being. She stumbled into the cabin and gasped for air. The cabin had a fine biomesh to purify the air without a suit. She had forgotten how sweet fresh air smelled. Funny how you appreciated something so simple after you'd been without it for a while. A quick look around the cabin told her that it had belonged to one of the cultists, one of those bizarre people who believed that the only way to properly terraform a world came by spiritually bonding people to it. They worked alone in groups of 4 or 5 and sent forth psychic shockwaves to help prime the world for human habitation. They had attracted some attention from the fringe media at first, but after enough studies, it was rather evident that if anything, the cultists somehow slowed the terraforming process by consuming resources that could be used for something else. Of course, the stupid Zra convention also permitted them freedom of religion. Bisha was rapidly becoming a supporter of benevolent dictatorships. Bisha looked around the cabin. It was a Spartan thing, with barely a handful of furniture and supplies. The hermit had quite clearly had something unusual in mind, because even cultists usually had the basics of humanity. There were no visible electronics anywhere. The cabin had 2 rooms, a bedroom, and a work/living space. The walls of the cabin were made of genetically modified trees that had been planted there at the Hell World's founding 4 generations ago. The bed was also made of solid hewn logs with several woven quilts underneath to provide a level of comfort and sleep. However, the tropical heat of the place left little need for blankets at night. Indeed, how someone could live here that long without a cooling unit was entirely beyond her. What she did know was that the loom in the far corner showed that the hermit had made everything himself. This place was remarkably well kept. Maybe he was she. Somehow she didn't think so. Hell Worlds did not have the typical forces of decay that a world with native life did, since most of the bacteria had to be imported. This made it easy to create materials that were resistant to it, so the cabin and all of the things in it that could theoretically have been here for a very long time without any visible sign of aging. Still, Bisha didn't think that it had been that long. Feel, intuition. Say what you would about the woman's intuition. Bisha preferred to trust her own senses. Sure, there might be things in the universe that the rational mind couldn't account for, but that didn't mean they did her any good. They certainly hadn't helped her to avoid the situation she currently found herself in. She found the food larder in the corner of a larger room. It contained a large assortment of fruits, berries, and cheese. Where had she gotten cheese? She supposed that someone could live off the fruits and such by gathering them in the forest. She'd passed a few fruit trees, and she ravenously ate one of the apples. Her common sense told her that this was not a good idea, since the hermit could have poisoned them, as was far more common in the uninitiated spacer might think, laced them with some kind of psychopathic drug, or psychedelic drug for that matter. But given the nature of her surroundings, she didn't think it likely. She sat down at the hand-carved chair next to the table and took a few minutes to rest. It was at least another 6 hours to the settlement, and it had been very hard going. She railed against the fates for making her such a small person that she wasn't feeling altruistic or heroic. She just didn't care enough, and she hated herself for it. A large banging began to tap the roof. At first she thought it might be a falling tree branch, but it kept happening over and over again. She looked at the window and saw, much to her horror, that fist-sized hailstones had begun to pelt the ground around the cabin for as far as the eye could see. The aisles of artificially planted trees left her feeling like she was looking in two mirrors placed side by side, getting smaller and smaller until they vanished in the darkness. The eerie beauty of the scene and the preternatural quiet of the forest caught her mind for a few moments until she realized the implications of what this meant. The radicals had gained control of the weather satellites. While the roof might be capable of protecting her from the sudden storm, and she thanked the hermit gratefully for it, if she stepped out into that nightmare, she was doomed. Her comm unit was not working properly, probably due to the interference of the radicals. This was all just insane. The militia was supposed to take care of this kind of thing. How could they screw up something so basic as securing the weather satellites? It was over. She spent over an hour doing nothing but crying. It was more than crying. It was a full-out fury. She attacked the wooden bed with her fists. The wood before her represented everything that was wrong with the world, and everything that she couldn't change. She beat on it until the skin on her hands started to chafe and become raw. Eventually, she collapsed from exhaustion and nearly went to sleep. Sleep would be good. There was nothing that she could do now anyway. She started to rise up to her knees when she spotted a small leather-bound book underneath the bed. She quickly thumbed through the delicate pages. Apparently, it had been some kind of a journal. She hesitated. She thought maybe there was something useful in the book, though what she couldn't begin to fathom. At least it was something to do, though she was terribly tired. With the exertion of will and a quiet respect for the dead, she slowly began to read the first portion of the journal. It had been written by one Adolphic Giraffe, who believed in nothing and no one. That surprised her a great deal, but she had to admit that she did not see any of the typical religious trappings around the cabin. "I am a damned soul," he wrote. Apparently, he had not been entirely without religion at all. She continued to read. "I have killed thousands in my time. There is nothing new in my torment. Every soldier worth anything from the beginning of time has eventually felt regret for the lives that he has taken. The only difference between them and I is that I have both the wealth and the opportunity to go far from humanity, at least as far from humanity as that any reasonable man still can." Bisha suspected that his self-proclaimed desire for penance and isolation was not as great as he let on, and that he was merely deceiving himself by making a show for it. And if that was the case, then he was a coward. She had no respect for cowards. She should know she was one. Eventually, she decided to read it because it was the only thing in the place to distract her from the palpable aura of depression she felt about the place. Or maybe that was just her. Same difference, really. "I will be honest. I have considered ending my life. However, I feel something inherently wrong with it. There is no honor in the act. It is too easy. It would not compensate for the lives I have taken. Yet in the end, is there honestly anything I could ever do that would allow such? I have come to understand the value of life, any life, no matter how small it is in the isolation of this place." Bisha sighed. She understood a lot of what this guy was saying. Oh, not the "I am a mass murderer" part, but the "I am lost and alone in a pointless world" part. She continued reading after skipping several entries. The lack of companionship is already starting to degrade the fringes of my mind. This is, of course, purely voluntary on my part. I can, at any time, go to the nearby primitives' village, but I find this distasteful. I came here to be alone. I am not sure if this slow madness of solitude is better for my soul, or simply a mental alcohol to wash away the memories of the past by filling them with hour upon endless hour in silently whispering forest. What I do know is that I hate it. I hate every limited living thing on this planet for the simple reason that it is. I know of no solution to the problem. An asteroid hermitage would be no better and no closer to what I seek, whatever that may be. She closed the book and looked around the small hut. What had happened to this guy? There were no evident clues about his having been here in a while. The place was very neat and extremely well kept. It was like they had gone away for a while, but were expecting to return. She slapped herself on the forehead. All she had to do was read the last entry in the journal. "We made it. I was wrong. I do not believe in any kind of god or godness or whatever. But I am forced to admit that I might be wrong. This annoys me. But I am not a stupid man, even if I am a stubborn one. I have recovered, and she has recovered. I will return the girl to the village, and I will return to my solitude. I will be a different man than I am, perhaps. But there are still many things I need to work out. It's frustrating, but it is something that I know I must do. I was surprised to find out that I have a soul after all. Bisha rubbed her eyes and shook her head. Well, now she knew why you weren't supposed to read the last page of a mystery novel. Still, she had the most important information. The man was not here. Ironically, this filled her with a pain of regret, since the man had gone on to one of the nearby villages, and the odds of survival were minute. He had gone from being a minor but pleasant distraction, indeed her only distraction, from her failure to a vivid reminder of her own failure. She tossed the book into a corner and wept like a little girl for what seemed like hours. She howled, she shrieked, she banged her fist on the bed, and threw a tantrum of shame and fury until she could hardly move. She checked the chronometer. It had been broken. Only 10 minutes had passed. It had to be broken. Only 10 minutes had passed. For a brief instant, she entertained the possibility that she might be dead, and then in some kind of bizarre hell. But the effects of time dilation on a mind had nothing to occupy it, were well known. She had never had to deal with the stress of this magnitude before, and she knew she wasn't handling it well. She still couldn't think of anything to do. The hail continued to smash the trees outside, like a pair of giant invisible hands breaking endless breadsticks. A few chunks of them even hit the house. The roof somehow managed to hold on to this endless assault, but it was enough to keep her from any kind of sleep, no matter how hard she tried. She had been the victim of her own conscience, though her rational mind told her that it would only be folly to go outside as it was. It would be suicide. What good would she be to the people of the village if she were dead? Still, to stay sane, she needed some kind of distraction, any kind of distraction. She looked back forlornly at the book. What a spoiled child she was. Having been raised in a world of endless entertainment and virtual reality, she had constantly had something in which to immerse her consciousness. 1,500 years ago, the medieval peasants of Europe had no such distractions. All they had was the ability to work and work with that soil. Occasionally, they might have had a puppet show or badly acted passion play to distract them, but that didn't matter much to her right now. She continued to read, but in the middle rather than at the end of the book. The roar I heard this morning could only have been from the landing of the ship, but I find it highly disturbing that the engines sounded like nothing I've ever experienced. Given the fact that neither aliens nor advanced prototype engineers would see fit to come to my lonely neck of the planet, I am forced to concede the possibility that someone might have made an emergency landing. I must break my solitude and move to discover the source. Another entry. I moved when the sun was in the middle of ascent in the morning, so I could have long shadows to help guide me on my journey. The bottom of the forest might be haunted by unending sameness, but the tops of the trees are different as any human being, and a clever man can use them to navigate the wood without a sat device. Such devices are prone to break down, and a man in a position such as me can hardly afford to have it replaced, at least not in the currency of the soul. I chose isolation for a reason. Another entry. After several hours, I was able to discover the source of the problem. It was indeed a spaceship, and it was a small one. I'd frankly never seen one that small. It was a cylinder of 2 meters in length and a meter in radius. At first I thought I'd been mistaken, but it was some kind of unmanned craft, but on closer look, I saw the thick ooze glass held something underneath that moved and writhed. I carefully pulled back the vegetation and on the cover and found the handle. I pulled the cockpit, and it opened with a hiss. Inside, I found a 7-year-old girl scared out of her mind. She was dressed in a standard station jumpsuit, though it was neat, folded, and pressed. She carried no ID of any kind, so I had no idea who she was, but she wasn't saying anything. All she was doing was crying. I lifted her out immediately after my watch confirmed that she was medically safe to move. Whatever was bothering her, it had nothing to do with injury. I carefully reached out and attempted to make cooing sounds as I pulled her out. She poked me in the eye. In retrospect, I suppose it is some kind of miracle that I did not react with physical violence. The wars were hard on those who survived them, and they carry a price on those that do. On the other hand, perhaps I'm just being cynical. Training has become much more advanced in recent decades, and unless a child is seen as a visible threat, no soldier will ever attack one. The ability to detect subtle motions of body language indicating a hostile threat is much easier in children, and generally only the most desperate of armies use their offspring in suicide attacks. No one has done so for centuries, not since the final Crusades, and no matter how bad the last war was, no matter how bad it felt, it does not come close to the horrors mankind has endured before the sword had been stuck back in its sheath. Now we all just endured endless brush fires across the world, even if sometimes those brush fires consisted of an entire planet. I was able to slowly drag her out after I beheld her hands on her sides. After I held her hands down to her sides. It was not an easy struggle, let me assure you. Age and lack of nutrition have slowly made their effects known on my physique. Still, in the end, my experience won out. I slung her on my back and began to carefully navigate my way back to the house, despite numerous and vocal violent protests. At the end, after several hours of shouting, she eventually quieted down and went to sleep. I took advantage of the situation and slept myself. I had not had any for almost a day, and I would see what I could do in the morning. Bisha knew that she should sleep. She knew that she should do something. The hermit's determination to rescue the girl made her realize this. The situation was hopeless. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized in the back of her mind that this was a cop-out. Something here had to be able to help her, but what could she do? Then she saw the metal wash bin that the hermit had been washing his clothes in. What would be more appropriate than to act like a hermit crab with a hermit's possessions? She almost squealed with delight, but it came out as more of a choked sob as she rushed for the metal tub and put it over her head as she headed out to the rain again. Her backpack with the precious vaccine was held aloft, and her head was also immediately protected. But while the vaccine was large, it was not large enough to cover all of her, and she found herself being bruised, battered, and bludgeoned in a most undignified fashion. She rapidly retreated back into the entrance of the house. The walls loomed before her. She knew she was going to fail if she didn't make it back. Still, the idea of giving up, appealing as it was, would not be allowed. Too many people depended on her success. And yet, did she know any of these people? All she had to do was say that she had become trapped in the weather, which was true, and had not been able to get there in time. Who was she to risk her life for them? She was an educated Terran, with vital medical training, whereas the people in the village were nothing but ground-pounding, ignorant religious snobs who probably couldn't tie their own shoelaces, much less use a regen device. It might be bigotry, but it was true. Oh, there were smart ones, of course, but even a broken clock was right twice a day. Even the shallowest gene pool had to have the occasional analogy in it. Of course, she was using her bigotry against the grounders as an excuse. Most of them might be ignorant, but that was hardly their fault. The development combine felt that their resources were better spent elsewhere. She almost felt sorry for them. But even if she maintained enough sanity to realize her prejudice, her sense of survival remained. She did not want to die, and despite a year's worth of medical training to the contrary, she gasped with relief when she made it back to the shelter. Then she looked at the gutter. Her life was pretty much in the gutter. She felt about as low as a person could possibly feel, almost wishing she could shrink herself down and slide into the mud like she were a worm. And then she looked at her legs and looked at the gutter, and she knew. She knew exactly what she had to do. She felt a little guilty about the damage she caused to this lovely home, but she knew he would understand. She hoped he would. She took out the huge gutters and put them on her legs. They weren't the best in the world, but they would provide sufficient armor until she was able to get the vaccines to the village. She put the metal wash tub over her back and set out into the jungle, patiently moving forward. Every step hurt. The jungle sucked. The rain sucked. The metal wash tub sucked. People sucked. Life sucked. She hated everyone and everything, and she wanted to curl up in the cabin and let these people die. It wasn't worth it. None of this was worth it. She didn't care anymore. It just had to end. And yet somehow, despite it all, despite the desire to end absolutely everything, even to take off the shell and let the stones smash her to bits, she kept going step by step. The journey never seemed to end. Indeed, after a while, she was sure she was lost, as if everything else wasn't just worse. She had a magnetic compass, but it was too hard to reach and she couldn't see anything. Ah well, at least she had tried. She would feel guilty for the rest of her life about the way she'd felt about these people, but at least she'd tried. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore and collapsed. She lay there for a long time. Everything hurt, and the clanging on top of the metal can never stopped. It was all part of the story where the villagers were supposed to find her at the last minute and take her back, and after she'd given her last out of strength. That was the way it was supposed to happen in the Holovids. No such luck. There would be no excuses. There would be no last-minute rescue. There was no one else. There was just her. She groaned and reached back into her pack. She felt something rip in her arm as she did, sending jolts of pain. She ignored it, or at least tried to. She looked at the compass. It pointed north. She just needed to go northeast if she was ever going to reach the village. And even if she and even then she could possibly miss it. It was hopeless, but she had to try. She got up and fell down 3 times before waiting, breathing in a lung full of mud, and then standing to try again. There was a knock outside of her tin. She lifted the faceplate and looked outside. She saw a gruff face looking back at her, the kind that looked like it had been against a grindstone for hours until all the edges had been worn away to reveal nothing but a calluses underneath. She tried to smile but couldn't manage. The hermit never said a word, and she couldn't say anything, not even if she tried. She still managed to reach down to the small pouch of vaccine and thrust it into the waiting hands of the hermit. He looked at her with a different look then, a kind of wonder that showed he could empathize with what she had been through and why. He bent down, picked her up like she weighed nothing, and carried her through the trees into several ramshackle huts beyond. She heard the shouts of greeting and exultation and knew that they understood what the medicine was for. She had done what she had come to do, and with that her mind blackened into unconsciousness. She knew peace without guilt at last, and she slept. When she woke up, she found herself in a hospital bed on the ship that had been bound by the system. The disaster had already cost the ship valuable time, and more importantly, the government was going to want to know what had happened here. She could barely move at first, moving in and out of consciousness, but the facilities aboard the men's ship were quite good. She didn't know what to make of the letters, dozens of them all thanking her for what she'd done, but she felt like she didn't deserve him. The little girl had written her, and apparently the ship with her, visiting her from time to time, but the hermit had never written anything. She felt a sense of loss at that, for reading through his journal, she'd felt a connection to him. She wanted to know who she was. He'd been the one ultimately responsible for helping her get through. She felt a little cheated, but given how close she had come to failure, she knew that no one had a right to any glory as they tried to laud her. She spent most of her time in the cabin by herself, looking at a tin. She found it waiting for her when she finally got out of the hospital. The hermit sent her a letter, but he had sent a chunk of metal. Whether it was a sense of approval or simply because she had ruined it, she didn't know. Deep in her heart, she liked to think it was the former, but suspected it was a bit of both. So, okay, story. I'm going to give this one a B rather than a B minus. The writing is not bad. It could, there's some awkward parts. It could definitely use an edit pass. When I eventually publish Swamp Castle as an anthology, which I do intend to do, I'm definitely going to need to hire an editor. Even reading it, I had to kind of fix a few things. And I think the two biggest problems with the story is when you write a short story, you need to avoid loose ends unless they are there deliberately. And, what we have here is we have flashbacks from the hermit. Okay, we do learn a few things about the hermit. We never learn his name. We learn that he's a soldier and that he's here because he's hurt a lot of people. And the setting itself, which I actually think is the most interesting part of the story. And I don't have a name for this setting, but I have used some of the concepts like the cheat drive and a few other things a few other times. It's kind of vaguely set in a future similar to what I do with my first novel, that I tried to kind of create in a sense of like the stories by Larry Niven and James Purnell and the Known Space series, which if you haven't read or heard about them, I recommend if you can. I decided that the ultimate thing that we need to do is like I said, the setting is interesting. A hard sci-fi, interstellar, slower than light setting is hard to write. Physics is a harsh mistress, and I think ultimately we will overcome it. I think FTL is going to happen, even if the science behind it is very speculative. But I think at the end of the day, if we don't kill each other, we tend to overcome things, and the universe is more complicated than we think it is. So I have no scientific basis for, except for a few vague articles on warp drive. But I think ultimately we will have FTL. But that doesn't mean that we might not still have centuries of slower than light travel. Either way, the future we do know is going to look so alien that... anyway, so my point is that the setting is interesting. Bisha is this is kind of a woman versus herself or a woman versus environment that has other people in it, and that's kind of what I was going for with this story, and that's why I give it a B, rather than a lower grade. But like I said, there's elements that don't make sense. Like, okay, so the hermit wasn't there because he rescues this little girl that landed in a tiny spaceship, but we don't know anything about the little girl, right? There's no closure about why she left, or the fact, I could have easily said that she escaped because she had accidentally caused the war that the radicals were using, and that had been the medical emergency, and she felt really bad about it. But it wouldn't have been necessary to complete the story where Bisha realized that she needed to grow up and do what she needed to. And so I guess my point is that I could have simplified it in the story by simply having a little village girl show up, and the old grizzled soldier realized he had to break his isolation and take her back. The fact that it had been a spaceship was an unnecessary detail that leaves the reader scratching their head going, wait, what? Exactly. So, basically, like I said, this is a story that I think could work. It's a little too long, but, some edit passes would make this printable. But I will also be honest, the basic premise of med tech and slower than light future civilization delivers vaccine to primitive planet and grows up doing it. I've read stories like this, a lot of them from the 70s and 80s, and I don't feel that this adds anything to the genre. I like the story. It's passable. It's entertaining. But these days, if you're going to publish a short story, you need to kick it up a notch. If you're going to get out of the slush pile, you need to be more inventive. So solid writing, with, that some editing could fix. Nothing here that can't, that's ridiculous, like the one story I didn't even bother to read, but, I could have done better.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!